Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And those of you who have chosen to support the show via jeffersonhour.com, the 1776 Club, or however you decide to, we thank you so much for that. Are we lucky to have Joseph Ellis pop in to this show? The conversations between you and he, Clay, they're timeless. They're priceless. They're just great. And this week, Joe comes on to talk about his book, His Excellency, on George Washington. This is a great conversation this week.
Well, he's writing a kind of a synthesis of his life's work now, and he's going back and dipping into his books and rereading sections of them and trying to sort of see what, if anything, he still needs to say that he's never had a chance to say, and if he's rethought some of his positions and so on. And so when we began having these conversations with him back in March when the pandemic struck, I thought, here's this extraordinary, award-winning, distinguished American historian, and he's retired, but I wanted to debrief him, to get a chance to really talk with him about the main body of his life's work and to share that with our listeners. I just think that he's an extraordinary man. He's very funny, he's witty, he's genial. Not too many people would submit to this. For me, it's just an honor. We sometimes disagree, but it's always with the greatest joy. And to talk about George Washington in the face of where we are now, and to think that was the leadership that is timeless. It allowed the tyrant of England, George III, to say, this is the greatest man in the world, George Washington. And a man who really was first in war, first in peace, and still first in the heart of his country. You know, he won the war, he won the peace, he became the unanimous first president, he set the protocols of the presidency. His judgment was extraordinary. Jefferson said he never knew a man whose judgment, slow to come to sometimes, but his judgment was perfect. And so as we descend into whatever kind of chaos we're in here,
something that really stuck with me in the past week was your comment about how we're living through some extraordinary times. It's hard on all of us, but you talked about how the humanities were a key to understanding all this and getting through all this. Do you recall that?
Absolutely, yes.
And that really, really stuck with me. So I guess this is kind of a backhanded pitch for Joe Ellis. I really would encourage people, if they have not read any of Joseph Ellis's work, to do that, to go read some. And I remember so distinctly the conversation with him. You have praised him numerous times for his prose, his writing style. And I remember distinctly him saying, thanks for that. And I work really hard to make it seem easy. And boy, he does. And he does well with that. So that's my pitch for Joe Ellis. So it's now your Hamiltonian moment if you have anything you'd like to pitch.
I will here in just a moment. Let me say again about Joe Ellis that not only is he a great prose stylist, which is very rare, and I loved it when he said that he writes primarily thinking about his students. He wants the respect of the historical academic community, but he's writing for people like his students. And the other thing I want to say about him is that he's fair. So he understands that humans are a mixed bag. Most historians have tended either to idolize their person, like Dumas Malone's Jefferson, or to demonize their person, as people are now routinely doing with respect to Jefferson. And Joe is much, I think, better than that, because he realizes there are some really, really amazing and great things about Thomas Jefferson. There are also some really troubling and problematic things about Thomas Jefferson. And guess what? You can't separate them. They're part of the same human being, because we're all this creature that is, just short of angelic, but also just this side of demonic, and everywhere in between. And Joe's amused by the human condition. And I think that that's a really key humanities insight, that the human condition is fascinating. And you don't have to judge it. It's much better to explore it. And he's really able to put people's foibles in a perspective that doesn't make you want to throw the book down and turn away in disgust. So I can't tell you, and I don't need to tell you, but how fortunate we are to have Joseph Ellis as our new favorite guest. Now, a quick pitch here. The winter encampments are among the favorite things that I get to do. This year, 3 of them. So we're doing Thoreau and Whitman. That's full. Then we're doing J. Robert Oppenheimer. That's full. And then we've opened a second Oppenheimer because there's been such a high demand. So there are 4 days, 24 through 28 January, west of Missoula. It's a magnificent thing to do. I perform as Oppenheimer. I'm actually talking one of our friends, Joseph Lovell, into coming and being the prosecutor at the security trial of J. Robert Oppenheimer that occurred in 1954. So Joe is going to play that aggressive role, and he's terrific at this and one of my closest friends. And so that's going to be the second one. I hope people will sign up for that. Also, after the Homer course, which I'm now teaching, the online Homer course, and by the way, I'm having just a really extraordinary satisfaction in doing that. And so those are coming. And after that, though, there's going to be a 5-part series on the Constitution and reforming the Constitution, attending to the difficult problems of the Second Amendment and guns, separation of church and state, the emoluments clause and all the trouble that it's given us, the war powers, the fact that we haven't had an amendment to the Constitution for decades, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be Constitution 101, but it's a kind of a debriefing about the debacle that we're in. And I don't mean the presidency or anything else. I mean the larger paralysis of our time. And so that's going to be a 5-part course. People can investigate that. I want to have a couple of sections on that. And then finally, the 2 summer trips, the Lewis and Clark trip, I think is almost full for next summer. And then we're going to do a Salmon River float trip, the River of No Return. Lewis and Clark did not go on it because they couldn't float it, but we can with a great outfitter. And it's a Class 3 river, and we're going to do conservationists. So there'll be Lewis and Clark, but then there will be Thoreau for a day. There will be Edward Abbey for a day. There will be John Muir for a day. And so it's going to be sort of every evening around the bonfire on the sand beach on this magnificent and isolated river in Idaho. We're going to talk about the great figures in the history of the American conservation movement. And so I can't wait for that. So people can go to the website jeffersonhour.com to find all that. Plus my books, the Jefferson book, Repairing Jefferson's America, is available. And my other book about the pandemic, Bring Out Your Dead, The Literature and History of Pandemics. So as you can hear from the speed of my speaking, that this is an incredibly active time in my life. I couldn't be more pleased. All I want now are gigantic book sales and full online courses.
Well, that was pretty Hamiltonian of you, Clay. We've gone far too long on this podcast intro. I apologize. But there are 3 things that I would like to leave our Jefferson Hour listeners with this week, if I might. And first off is, if the Jefferson Hour stands for anything, to me, it stands for civility, for civil discourse. And Jefferson, talking about disagreements amongst neighbors, said, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Civility. And second is the pandemic. It's the infection rates where we live are incredibly high. And I would encourage all listeners to be vigilant, stay safe, and stay healthy. And lastly, no matter how you decide to do it safely, and I encourage you all to vote. And with that, again, thank you for listening. And now let's go to this week's show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. And we are pleased today to welcome back Professor Joseph Ellis, an American historian whose work focuses on the lives and times of the Founding Fathers. His books include American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, which won a National Book Award in 1997, and Founding Brothers, the Revolutionary Generation, which won the 2001 Pulitzer Prize for History. And both of these books were bestsellers. He joins us today for the second in a series of discussions on his books, and today we will be discussing His Excellency, George Washington, published in 2004. And welcome to you, Joe.
David, hey, it's great to be with you.
I know Clay has many questions for you, but before I step back, I'd like to read just a paragraph or two from the introduction to this book. It's about your recollections of George Washington as a child. Quote, Washington was more omnipresent for me than Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, but also more distant. Jefferson, it seemed, was like Jesus, who had come to earth and spoken directly to us. Washington was like God himself, levitating above it all like the man in the moon. It seemed to me that Benjamin Franklin was wiser than Washington. Alexander Hamilton was more brilliant. John Adams was better read. Thomas Jefferson was more intellectually sophisticated. James Madison was more politically astute. Yet each and all of these prominent figures acknowledged that Washington was their unquestioned superior. I have to tell you, I read that introduction to the book and you had me, sir.
I'm glad you read that last part of that, because I remember writing that and thought it might be appropriate today, so I was going to refer to it. So now I don't have to.
So, Joe, I'm so glad to talk with you. I reread this book. I think I told you last time we spoke that deciding which is my favorite of your books is not at all easy, and it sort of reminds me of something one of my professors once said. He said, "Which Dickens novel do you like best? Well, which one did you most recently read?" So that's true, but I love His Excellency, and I want to ask you a question. I'm going to read a passage here in a short time, but I want to ask this question. I know you're going to, bob and weave and so on, but I don't want you to. One of the things that I most admire about you is just the quality of your prose. Your prose is clear, it's incisive, it's direct, but it's amusing. It's often bemused, it's witty. So who taught you this? And you don't just wake up at the age of 16 and you're a terrific writer. Who taught you how to write?
I don't have, I don't have an answer to it. It's clear. The answer is I don't know. I guess one answer is that when I was in graduate school, and I was at Yale, which has a great American history program, probably the best in the country, and I always wondered how the hell I ever got in. And because I hadn't even majored in history as an undergraduate at William and Mary. And one time I asked my then mentor, a guy called C. Van Woodward. I later switched to a guy called Ed Morgan. I asked Woodward, I said, everybody here knows a lot more than I do, and they're better prepared, and I'm not sure I'm ready for this, and how the hell did you guys ever bring me here? And he said, you can write.
Precisely.
And I said, I can. Oh, good. But I must have done something in the essay that's required to be, and all something like that. I think that, I guess two things come to mind. One is I care about it. In other words, I spend a lot of time working on it. What might look easy, if somebody says, "Oh, that was a great paragraph, Joe," and I say, "Yeah, it took about 3 weeks." I think that I was probably affected by the fact that I was educated by the Jesuits, and we had to write an essay a day, and we took, and I had 6 years of Latin and 4 years of Greek. And I think that affected my understanding of prose, or of sentence structure, and of the language itself. Every year I reread The Great Gatsby, because to me, Fitzgerald and not Hemingway is the stylist with rhythm and with a sense of how words sound, almost like a song. And if you can get that rhythm, your own rhythm, that's really a great secret. I'm going on a little bit long, but it's an ineffectual answer to a very difficult question.
Let me ask a follow-up question first, although as a kind of a pathetic North Dakota footnote, Jay Gatsby was from North Dakota.
That's right.
I'm going to read you this passage in a minute, but I want to ask a follow-up question first. And I know this will sound crazy to our listeners, but it won't sound crazy to you. Has the fact that you're so good a prose stylist hurt you? Because as you know, in some academic circles, there is a privileging of obscurantism and jargon and semicolons and impossibly long and Ciceronian sentences, and they're suspicious of good writers.
I mean, I wouldn't push it that far. I would say that they don't care much about it, and but I think that it does touch on something. Most academics are writing for other academics. That is to say, the books they generate are scholarly books that are written for other people in the field of history that they are in, and so their prose is shaped by their own values as historians in the scholarly sense of the term. My audience isn't other historians. My audience is, the people I think of are like the students I taught at many schools. They're people who are really, really smart and they don't know anything. So I don't know. I think that it often it upsets me at times when I get reviewed and nobody talks about whether it's well written or not, and because among scholars that doesn't make much difference.
Well, it certainly does to me, and I'm going to read you this. And David, I think you're just going to love this. This is page 149. So Washington is between gigs, as we say. The war is over. He's retired to his vine and his fig tree, as he loves to say. And he really does think that that's it, that now he's a senior retired general, the father of his country, that he'll live out his life as a plantation owner. And, he's a celebrity, but his public service is largely at an end. And this is what you say of him. This is one of my favorite paragraphs in the book. There was also one new ingredient in the heroic chemistry: Washington's growing recognition that just as his place in the heavens was assured, his time on earth was running out. During the war, he was too preoccupied with the daily duties of command to notice that he had moved past the allotted time, 50 years, that male members in the Washington line seldom reached, and that he referred to as the meridian of life. As he observed to the officers at Newburgh, his hair had in fact grown gray in the service of his country. Those huge eye sockets were now permanently creased. The impressive muscularity of his torso had begun to soften and sag. The massive bone structure that had carried him with such grace on horseback or on the dance floor was now afflicted with rheumatism. The man who had once led the pack in fox hunts now often declined the invitation to join the hunt rather than bring up the rear. A somber note of resignation began to appear in his correspondence, the poignant tone of a once great athlete past his prime who felt literally in his bones that he was gliding down the stream of life. When Lafayette departed Mount Vernon after an extended visit in 1784, the parting prompted nostalgic reminiscences of bygone days and a stoic forecast of encroaching darkness. Joe, it just doesn't get any better than that. That's an indelible portrait of middle-aged Washington, and what makes it so astonishing is how much public service was still ahead of him.
I mean, everybody, you think of the presidency as a capstone in Washington's life. He thought of it as an epilogue. He always thought his major achievement was winning the war, and it's a phrase maybe right near that passage. He says to Lafayette, he could feel that he was gliding down the stream of life to eventually, to not so far off, enter the mansion of my fathers, by which he meant the ground, and he ends up saying, "I have had my day." I'm pleased that it resonates. I spent a lot of time on that, but Washington himself was not eloquent. Jefferson was eloquent. When you have Jefferson, you don't have to try hard to put eloquent words in the book, because every time you quote him, it's lyrical.
You can never rise to his standard. No one can.
That's right. In Washington, you've got to do it yourself. And that challenge was something that I felt when I wrote the book. As we get started here, I was thinking about this conversation for the last day or two, and I thought, and I found this quotation that I wanted our listeners to hear because it's rather strikingly relevant for the troubled time in which we live. May I quote?
Of course.
This is from the farewell address. However political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. That's Washington's farewell address, 1796.
That's a good place for us to take just a short break from this conversation, if we might, sir.
All right.
We'll rejoin this conversation with Clay Jenkinson and the author Joseph Ellis about his book, His Excellency, George Washington, in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're so pleased this week to be joined once again by the noted author, Professor Joseph Ellis.
So, Joe, I love your writing, and I think that's one of the things that allows one to propel through your books, that if reading a standard academic history, and I have deep admiration for them, a reader often bogs down and feels, okay, that's a lot of detail, or this is a long chapter on the Constitutional Convention, but your writing is such that it really carries the reader through, and I read your books as much to enjoy the prose style as I do the substance itself, but I don't want that to obscure the substance. So let me ask you some easy questions here about George Washington. He was a plaster saint in his own time, and he attracted a mythology even in his own era, partly which he nurtured because it increased his auctoritas, his sense of authority, but part of it just happened. So we know some things are wrong. We know that the whole cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie story was invented by Parson Weems after the fact. What about the crossing of the Delaware? There's no American that hasn't seen that heroic painting. It is a magnificent painting. Tell us I'm sure he was at the bottom of the boat clinging to it. What really happened there?
The painting that you referred to is by a German named Lutze, L-E-U-T-Z, who was painted in 1851 in Dusseldorf, Germany. He got some Americans who were studying in Germany to pose for the characters, but the boat's all wrong. The boats they used look like the landing craft in World War II at Normandy, or on the Pacific Theater. He was standing up, and everybody was standing up. So that is wrong about it. If that picture were correct, he would be thrown headlong into the ice. It is an important moment in the war, though it's not as significant as some people believe. It's like Doolittle's raid on Tokyo. The Continental Army has just been soundly defeated on Long Island and Manhattan, and it's really looking grim. And this is a kind of moment when this strike against Trenton recovers some semblance of possibility for what they call the cause. It's more a moral victory than a strategically significant victory. But the Lutze painting is probably, in some sense, it's the most famous painting in American history.
Yeah, it's a great painting, and I love it. Monroe was on that mission too, wasn't he?
That's right. Monroe was wounded in the wrist. He almost bled to death at Trenton in this battle, and it's misrepresentative, but it's still a great painting.
And it's as you said, it was the raid was a great morale booster for a ragtag army that wasn't doing very well. One of the things that I find so admirable about Washington is that he forced his troops to be inoculated for the smallpox, and you say that probably played as much a role in the American victory and holding that army together as anything that he ever did.
I stand behind that. Washington himself only left the country once when he visited Barbados with his brother, and he caught the smallpox, almost died. But he was forever immune after that, and he realized that smallpox was a real threat and to the army. And he had figured this out before at Mount Vernon, and he inoculated all his slaves. He was the only slave owner that did that. But casualty rates in the Revolution were predominantly disease, and smallpox was the most prevalent disease. There was a raging smallpox epidemic going on throughout America, generated in some sense by the war and the gathering together of people in units like that in dense populations, and the total casualty rates, if you take Army and Navy together during the Revolution, were about 50,000. Of the 50,000, over 30,000 were by disease.
So that smallpox epidemic has implications for our world out here in Dakota, because it swept through the entire nation and killed off the great bulk of the Mandan and the Arikara people in 1781, and had implications that followed the Mandan history all the way out, but particularly up to Lewis and Clark. Here's another question for you, Joe. Washington helped to set the protocols of what the presidency is, and we're living at a time when we are really thinking about all of these questions. And, for example, the number of justices on the Supreme Court is not set by the Constitution, it's set by Congress. So we're thinking about these things because so much of what we do is not actually grounded in the Constitution itself. It's grounded in protocols, many of which were set by George Washington. One of my favorite moments is early on in his presidency, when he went up to the Congress of the United States to confer with the Senate, thinking that that was the right thing to do about some Indian treaties, and the Senate treated him shabbily, and he said, "This defeats the whole purpose of my coming," and he never went back. Tell us about that.
Well, you're right. I'll answer the specific and then broaden it a bit. That in 1790, he wanted to sign a treaty with the Creek Nation. It's the first treaty that he wants to sign is a treaty with Native Americans designed to avert Indian removal by giving the Creek Nation control over its own land and guaranteeing them that the federal government will protect them from the invasion of white settlers. So he goes to the Senate, and because the Constitution says that he must advise and consent with the Senate. Well, what does advise and consent mean? Well, he thinks, and understandably so, that means he has to go there and ask their approval for the treaty. And when he does, it's all chaos, and the people don't know what to do. I mean, they say, "Let's give us more evidence." And as you say, he gets upset with them and walks out with Henry Knox, his Secretary of War, who's with him, and says, "This defeats my every purpose for coming here." He does come back once, 2 days later, to sort of say, "Okay, here it is, sign this damn thing." But that's the last time that any president of the United States interprets that phrase in the Constitution to mean he must directly consult. From that time forward, the advising consent means send them written requests or documents and have them act on it. And the precedent set that way in 1790. More broadly, if you read Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States, which describes executive power, I challenge you to tell me what it says a president can do and not do. The language is deliberately elliptical and ambiguous because they're very, very worried about any robust expression of executive power. They have in their minds George III. Think about the indictment of George III that Jefferson writes in the Declaration. And so monarchy is like the ghost at the banquet throughout the Constitutional Convention. And the real powers of the presidency, as they have evolved over the succeeding almost 2.5 centuries, were not a function so much of the language of the Constitution, but the precedents that Washington himself set in the 8 years of his initial presidency.
Just one little footnote to your story. The person who read the treaty out that day was John Adams, the vice president of the United States, and there was noise coming in the street and they couldn't hear it. He had to reread the whole thing. It just sounds like it was a totally chaotic moment in the history of the relationship between the executive and the Senate, and it changed the course of American history. Amazing.
It did, and I won't go on this, but the treaty he was attempting to negotiate was an attempt to avoid one of the great tragedies of the founding, namely Indian removal. The other is slavery. And he and Knox were together really committed to saying that mistreatment of the Native American population was at odds with the values they had thought they were fighting for throughout the war. So this is one area where Washington stands alone almost in insisting that the revolution is at odds with the deprivation of depriving the native population of its property.
One of the most important elements in your book, in my opinion, is that at the end you return to these two questions. And I'll set it up by saying that in one of our previous conversations, you said, I think brilliantly, that our relations with African Americans have been Shakespearean tragedy, but our relations with Native Americans are Greek tragedy. In other words, that it's a virtually inevitable tragedy, whereas the relationship with African Americans is one that could have been modified or even averted by better counsel. So fair enough. That's great. At the end of your book, you come back to those two things, and you spend some time at it. And this is, I think, one of the great contributions of your biography, His Excellency, George Washington. You say that he wasn't going to die without doing something meaningful with respect to slavery, and he wasn't going to die without trying to do something meaningful with respect to removal of Native people.
It's true. I mean, and he was going to fail in both. On the Native American, he said, what makes it a Greek tragedy that is built-in, unavoidable, is, I hesitate to say this, but democracy. That ordinary Americans want that land out there. They, the expansion of the population across the Appalachians into the West, the then West, and is unstoppable. And Washington says nothing other than a Chinese wall could stop them. And he fails. He doesn't like to fail. His life is spent not failing and winning wars and doing things that succeed. On slavery, I think I wish he was more committed. He misreads the situation with regard to slavery. He thinks that slavery is dying, and if in the window of opportunity to end it is opening, when in fact just the opposite is true. And the one thing he succeeds in doing is freeing his own slaves, but he only frees them in his will when he says when Martha dies. He owns a little over 300 slaves, and 100 more than Jefferson. But only half the slaves at Mount Vernon belonged to him. The other half belonged to his wife, Martha, who has inherited them from her former husband. And so he does insist that when he dies, he wants all his slaves to be freed upon her death and to be provided with resources that will allow the younger ones to be educated. What happens is that soon after he dies, rumors circulate throughout Mount Vernon that they know the terms of the will and that they have to wait until Martha dies. So the rumors circulate that they're going to poison her. And so she, instead of risking that, decides to free them immediately. And so they're freed in 1801.
My goodness. I want to go to another question here, and this is more related to our normal attempts to make sense of the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. In reading your book, the inevitable impression that one takes away is that by the time Washington died, their relationship, their friendship had entirely broken down. It had been a period of stiff cordiality, and now there was nothing, and that the fault, if there is fault in the breakdown of that friendship, was overwhelmingly Thomas Jefferson.
I think that's true. Jefferson is Washington's Secretary of State. Washington is the first president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson is the first Secretary of State of the United States. Previously, they'd gotten along very well. They were both Virginians. They weren't neighbors, but they knew each other. When Washington resigned his commission, this great moment in December of 1783 when he gives up power. And Washington is a real aficionado of exits. He knows how to give up power more dramatically than any person in American history. It's actually Jefferson, people don't know this, who writes his final speech, I'm convinced, and who then says, that this is the great act of a leader. And he writes, a friend of his, Jones, said that the revolution will succeed because of one man. He is not Cromwell, he is not Caesar, he is Washington. And if he was able to look ahead with a crystal ball, he would have said he's not Napoleon, he's not Lenin, he's not Mao, he's not Castro, he's not a ton of African chief dictators. He surrenders power. I mean, George III said that when hearing the news, if he has done that, he will be the greatest man in the world, and he was. So up until the time he's in the same administration, Jefferson is close to Washington and very supportive. Party wars put them on different sides. And in that division, I'm afraid that Jefferson is duplicitous. He is sending word to his friends outside the capital, in first New York, then Philadelphia, that, and in France especially, where Monroe is the American ambassador or representative, saying, don't pay any attention to what Washington tells you to do. He's an old man. He's past his prime. He's senile. The real power of this behind the throne here is Hamilton. That is not true. But it's suicidal to go straight up against Washington, and so they're going to blame it all on Hamilton. But that his behavior is covert and behind the scenes and libelous. And Washington eventually finds out about this. A famous letter, the Batside letter that Jefferson writes, that's made public, criticizing Washington. And Washington writes him a letter, to Jefferson, which is the way one Virginia gentleman tells another Virginia gentleman that he no longer believes he has any honor. And when Washington dies, and remember, Mount Vernon is only 8 miles from Washington, D.C., or the capital, Washington City. And when Jefferson's president and says he wants to come out and visit her, she tells him, don't come. My husband said, I never want you to set foot on this land. I'm afraid it ends badly that way.
Yeah, so this, as you say, it's a long and complicated story. And Jefferson was reluctant to condemn Washington. I mean, the other Virginians, Jefferson and Monroe and Madison and their ilk, were disappointed in Washington, and they wanted to save appearances by saying, well, his mind is not quite what it once was, and it's the evil Hamilton who's manipulating him. But in fact, they were hinting that Washington had betrayed the revolution. And so a sad, sad thing that these two great Virginians could not find some way to patch it up. As you know, John Adams and Jefferson were able to patch it up in the end, thanks to some time and Benjamin Rush.
The underlying problem between the two parties here, again, summing up a lot very quickly, the Federalist, which is the Washington and Adams party, and Hamilton, believes that the American Revolution meant American nationhood, and the federal government was a fully empowered government after the Constitution to embody that nation. The other Virginians you mentioned, and most of the South, thought that was a betrayal of the Revolution, was the creation of a powerful federal government that was just as potentially tyrannical as Parliament was. And underlying their conviction on that score was the notion that the states, not the federal government, were sovereign. And underlying that was a strong desire to protect slavery. And the Jefferson Party was a Southern party. Now, Jefferson also really did believe, independent of the slavery question, that any robust expression of executive power was potentially tyrannical. He did. But But that's the underlying difference politically between the two sides.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break from this conversation, but we'll return to it in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. In fact, this week's conversation is about President George Washington. We're speaking with the author of George Washington, His Excellency, Professor Joseph Ellis. And Joe, I want to quote you something from your book once more, if I might, sir.
Go right ahead.
You begin chapter 6, First in Peace, by writing, looking back over 200 years of the American presidency, it seems safe to say that no one entered the office with more personal prestige than Washington, and only two presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, faced comparable crises. But there were some things that happened during Washington's presidency that we look back and perhaps question.
Washington did some things that were very controversial and unpopular, like he declared neutrality with France and to avoid a war at a time when that was very unpopular, and so-called Jay Treaty. And his attempted Indian removal was very unpopular. And he thought the duty of a president was to represent what he regarded as the great public interest, which at any moment in time might not be popular. Washington's greatest achievement was winning the war for independence.
But it seems as if he really recognized raw talent and he knew how to utilize it.
He knows how to delegate, and he also recognizes talent. I mean, among the founders, as you quoted me at the beginning of the program, Hamilton's the smartest. I mean, he would have gotten the highest grades on the SATs.
So, Joe, a couple of quick things here. So I do believe that in terms of character, Washington is superior to his. There may be several that match it. Here are a couple of things that are usually regarded as Washington weaknesses. I want to run them by you and get your comment. Number one, he loved to be loved by women. He wasn't a philanderer. He was none of that. But he just loved that women adored him, and he danced all night with people, and he really liked it when comely women on his travels gushed over him. So there's some kind of a susceptibility that he wanted to be regarded as that guy, but he was strict about his morals. But there's that. Secondly, he had a volcanic temper, and he managed to control it most of the time. But there are these accounts, and you report several of them, where Freneau got under his skin to the point where he went berserk, and other unscrupulous writers from the Jefferson camp, and he would throw things down and throw a fit. And Jefferson, I think, on one time said that his anger was the greatest single instance of anger that he had ever seen in George Washington. And the third area where we find Washington less than fully admirable is his almost tyrannical obsession with profit and suspicion that every overseer was cheating him, that every worker was lazy, that somebody somewhere was taking advantage of him. Is that a fair assessment of his weaknesses?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I'll go backwards on them. I mean, the last one is clearly true. Neither you nor I nor anybody within range of this radio broadcast would ever want to work for George Washington. He was a hard taskmaster, and for the soldiers under him, and he had no function. If you deserted the Continental Army, he's going to string you up. And his overseers at Mount Vernon felt his wrath all the time, and he always thought that people were trying to cheat him. So that there's truth in that one. With regard to the first one about women, if you describe Washington physically, he sounds almost like a Olympic athlete, which he was, but he was really graceful in the saddle, and he was graceful on the dance floor, and he loved women. But I can tell you, over 200 years, people, historians, and various writers have attempted to discover that the phrase "George Washington slept here" meant promiscuity. And you cannot find it.
No evidence.
It's not there. I think he loved his wife, Martha. His real love of his life was a woman called Sally Fairfax that happened to be married to his best friend. But he was loyal to Martha throughout his life.
What about his temper, his volcanic temper?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. I mean, Washington's exterior muscularity. Washington was a physical specimen, but he had interior muscularity as well as exterior to control his extraordinary temper and passion. And every once in a while, when it exploded, it just scared people. And when the painter Gilbert Stuart was doing one of his portraits of Washington, and the portrait comes out as what's called the Lansdowne portrait. It's the iconic portrait. But when he described Washington in a letter to his friend at the time, he said that this man, he described him in physical terms that ended with, he looks like the wildest animal in the forest. What he was seeing isn't the way he was replicating Washington. And so all these Stuart portraits and all the images we have from the 18th century are sort of classics that make these people into frozen figures. And Washington, as much as anybody else, is an icon. And yet he really was an extraordinarily volatile human being.
So we're talking about volatility, temperament, tempers. And I want to go back to the Martha Washington story, which we've talked about, her two saddest days of her life, the first being when her husband died, and the second in January of 1801, when Thomas Jefferson visited Mount Vernon. She's quoted as saying, "She assured a party of gentlemen, of which I was one, that next to the loss of her husband, Jefferson's visit was the most painful occurrence of her life." And I wanted to ask you, Joe, about something I've read. Maybe you can confirm it. My understanding is that Jefferson, for whatever reason, refused to attend Washington's memorial service. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. He believed that the only thing that had allowed the Federalists to succeed in especially its foreign policy, was one man. The potency and political popularity of one man, and he actually said he was lucky to lose the election of 1796, because anybody who came after Washington was going to have a disastrous time. Every time you study Washington and you add Jefferson to the conversation, Jefferson's not going to look good.
Except, I do think that Jefferson didn't attend those services in part because A, Jefferson didn't attend services like that anytime, but B, he was also feeling very sheepish.
Probably felt sheepish about embarrassing Martha there.
Right.
I think that's true. And remember, Adams doesn't attend the inauguration of Jefferson.
Yeah, well, we're coming back to that.
Yeah.
But in private, Jefferson said that they couldn't survive the heroic image of Washington. I think that's pretty significant.
It's difficult for us to fully appreciate the significance of Washington as the central figure in the American founding. He is the foundingest father of them all. He's there at the beginning to go to war, risk his. Jefferson writes the words, "Our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Washington lives them. He's there to make the Constitutional Convention legal and significant and successful, and he's there to then guide the government through the first 8 years of its existence. Nobody else comes close, and all republics fall victim to demagogues, and Washington, especially in their early years, and Washington's like the center of gravity, and if you didn't have him, it's very difficult to imagine how the American founding would have succeeded.
Sounds like an indispensable man to me.
Yeah, he is. And then one of the reasons he's indispensable is that he says all leaders, including presidents, are disposable.
Joseph Ellis, fascinating conversation. I do urge everyone to read His Excellency George Washington, published by Knopf in 2004, so right in the middle of your great list of books. You called George Washington a realist visionary, with equal emphasis on both words that differentiates him from the other members of the founding generation. This has been a spectacular conversation. It really does illuminate the character of George Washington, and I will look forward, as I know will all of our listeners, to the next installment in our series of historical discussions with Dr. Joseph Ellis, now living in an undisclosed location in the Green Mountains of Vermont. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thanks for putting up with me. Take care.
You too, sir. And with that, it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
The President and the United States Senate have a constitutional right to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court left by the death of Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They will almost certainly use that right. Frankly, if the situation were reversed, the Democrats would probably do the same thing. Why? Because the stakes are so high. Today's Supreme Court is almost infinitely more powerful than the Founding Fathers intended it to be, even those who favored a strong judiciary. From a purely political point of view, President Trump and the Republicans would be nuts not to try to increase the conservative majority on the court to 6-3, no matter what they might have said back in 2016 when Majority Leader Mitch McConnell declared that it was an essential principle not to seat a Supreme Court justice within 7 months of a national presidential election. They would rather be called hypocrites than men and women of integrity. The Supreme Court consists of 9 unelected and unaccountable individuals. They are not always, or perhaps even often, the high-minded, politically neutral, scrupulously fair, thoughtful, objective, and unbiased lovers of due process and the Constitution they would need to be to deserve as much power as they hold in their hands. Think of the personal lives of those men of sterling character, Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh, for example, or Justice Alito's theory of, quote, the unitary executive, a concept that might possibly have pleased Alexander Hamilton, but would have made George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison roll over in their graves. The U.S. population has now reached 340 million. Each member of the House of Representatives now represents 788,000 Americans, and each U.S. senator represents almost 7 million people. And those are the more representative public officials. Think about it. Each member of the U.S. Supreme Court now represents 37 million people. Are you comfortable with one man or woman making decisions for 37 million others? Even if they were all John Marshall, or Louis Brandeis, or Oliver Wendell Holmes, that is approximately 30 million times too much power to put into the hands of any single human being, ever. You don't have to be an Augustinian to realize that all human beings are a mixed bag of admirable and not so admirable characteristics and impulses, and we know that power inevitably distorts and corrupts human character. Now, under Mr. Jefferson's political theory, remember, the people of the United States are sovereign. They are entitled by natural law to govern themselves. Under our representative system, they waive that right and empower elected officers to represent their interests in the public arena. We have frequent elections, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, so that the people can remove from public office anyone who does not faithfully represent their interests. But a Supreme Court justice, once nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, serves for life. Mr. Jefferson would argue that this should never have happened. According to the sage of Monticello, the people are sovereign, and of the 3 branches of the national government, the legislature should be the supreme branch, and of the legislative branch, the House of Representatives should be supreme, because it is the body of the national government that is closest to the will of the people. It gets worse. If the Supreme Court did nothing but evaluate the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress, and adhered only to the strictest confines of the law in deciding cases that percolate up from the lower courts, we might find a way to live with that. But we all know that the Supreme Court justices are political beings just as senators are, or state governors or presidents, and they often decide cases according to their inevitable human biases. That's why a vacancy on the Supreme Court is now one of the hottest political flashpoints in American life. The stakes are so high because we are appointing not judges, but unelected legislators, indeed enormously powerful legislators who work in the dark behind closed doors, who hold the lives of 1/3 of a billion people in their highly political hands. You cannot blame the president for wanting to promote his agenda for America by way of the Supreme Court. Filling Justice Ginsburg's seat is way more important than some Senate race in Colorado or North Carolina. It is more important than maintaining control of the U.S. Senate. In fact, it may be more important than winning re-election as president. After all, presidents come and go after no more than 8 years, but a Supreme Court justice might serve for half a century or more. Is there a way to fix this? Yes. Here are 3 suggestions. We could change the Constitution so that justices serve for no more than 15 years, with a vote of confidence or no confidence in the middle. Ending life tenure would immediately lower the stakes in the Supreme Court selections. A second reform would be to have a committee of law professors, members of the American Bar Association, and nonpartisan political theorists produce a list of 10 eminent candidates from which the president can choose one. In other words, we need to take the selection of Supreme Court judges out of the hands of routine politicians as much as possible. I would also suggest that Congress pass a law requiring the upper courts and the Supreme Court to refuse to adjudicate cases that actually belong in the legislative branch. Gigantic questions like same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights, access to reproductive services, questions involving separation of church and state, would only safely be entrusted to the Supreme Court if the justices were creatures out of American idealism's civics text. But because they are ordinary political beings like everybody else, with prejudices, biases, blindnesses, partisan and at times corrupt practices, we cannot trust them with our national destiny. The great questions should be decided by more than 9 people who happen to have a law degree. My third suggestion is that we create a Supreme Court of, say, 15 justices, and we use a random generating app to select 9 justices to decide each case. The more justices, the lower the political temperature. The political intensity of 7 justices would be greater than our 9, and the intensity if there were just 3 justices would be almost infinite. Bringing in even a moderate amount of randomness for every case would relieve a great deal of tension. Presidents today routinely say they don't have a litmus test for their nominees, but we all know they do. Thomas Jefferson liked to quote the ancient Roman adage, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Translation, okay, so we need guardians, but tell me, who will guard us from our guardians? This is an unanswerable question. If we're going to have a national debate about a manger scene on the courthouse lawn, about abortion rights, about whether a Catholic hospital can deny its employees access to birth control, or about the wisdom of the national healthcare system, I want that debate to be inclusive, exhaustive, and transparent, and I want the entire country to participate in the conversation out in the open. And I decidedly do not want to permit those debates to occur behind closed doors among people who never have to face the judgment of the people of the United States. The horrific national controversy now just beginning around the filling of the Ginsburg seat is the best indication we have that we need to reform the Supreme Court to make it less powerful, less exclusive, less shrouded in secrecy, and dramatically less partisan. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.